Okay, thanks for joining us for our podcast on social interaction in autism, challenging current models with innovative experimental methods. My name's Dr. Brett Heisman, and I'm joined here today with Dr. Kerrianne Morrison, Dr. Noah Sasson, Dr. Sue Fletcher-Watson, and Dr. Catherine Crompton.
Hi.
Hello. So we can talk a little bit about why we're here doing this podcast on our research. So Sue, do you want to lead on that since you put the webpage together?
Sure. So the history of it is that I think we came to a realization that a few of us in different universities around the world were all converging on this same sort of idea, which is that there's some really interesting findings coming out exploring the way that autistic people interact with each other and how that's distinct from their interactions with non-autistic people. And theoretically, this can be tied to the double empathy problem, which is a really exciting, innovative kind of theoretical proposition developed by Damian Milton that places a lot more emphasis on the interactional space as opposed to on the autistic individual as the site of any kind of disabling problems in the social domain. So the social difficulties associated with autism come from that mismatch. Damian calls it a mismatch of salience between the autistic and the non-autistic person. So we were all kind of investigating that in different ways, and even though the theory has a lot of support in the community and there's a lot of anecdotal evidence to support it, a lot of autistic people giving accounts of their personal experiences, there wasn't really much in the way of experimental, empirical evidence, and that's the gap that we wanted to fill. So we put together this symposium and we submitted it, and it did not get accepted, and we are so chill about that. It's completely fine. But we wanted to try and bring the different presentations together so that people could see how those different pieces fit together and how that supports and develops the theory.
Okay, great. Thanks for that intro, Sue. So maybe we could kick off by giving a brief overview of each of our individual research that we've been doing in this area. And I think it's good to just be each other's audience and ask questions as we go along. So I don't know who wants to go first.
All right, I'll go first. So this is Kerrianne. In my project, I was interested in looking at double empathy theory, so seeing how two autistic adults interact with each other in a real-time conversation, and also comparing that to the mismatched conversations as well. Someone with autism interacting with a typically developing adult, and then comparing all of that to how two neurotypical adults interact as well. So what I did was I was really inspired by a lot of the work that we've been doing in my lab looking at first impressions. I also wanted to see how some of those ideas would translate into a real world context as well. So I recruited groups to come into the lab to have a 5-minute unstructured conversation. So people were just told the only instruction they were given was get to know each other better. You have 5 minutes. I turned on the camera and just kind of let people talk. And so after the 5-minute conversation, the majority of the study was people completing different questionnaires and measures. So people completed a lot of measures about what they perceived of their partner in terms of first impression traits especially. So how awkward or attractive do you think your partner is? Different traits like that. Also how much interest they would have in interacting with their partner again in the future. And also other measures more looking at what people thought of the overall conversation. Did you disclose personal information? Do you feel close to your partner after the 5 minutes? So what we found was that autistic adults are perceived as more awkward, less attractive, and also less socially warm than typically developing adults in those conversations. And actually those impressions are made both by autistic adults and also neurotypical adults as well. So in that sense, I guess we did not support the double empathy theory there, and that these some of these more negative impressions are still being made by other autistic adults. But where we did find support for the double empathy theory was in terms of interest in interacting again in the future. We found that the typically developing adults rated that they had more interest in interacting with other neurotypicals, whereas we found the autistic adults actually wanted to interact more with the autistic adults. So even though they maybe are picking up on these things like awkwardness, maybe less attractiveness, they're not holding that against their autistic partners. They actually want to interact more with them, probably because of the conversational content, the similarities that they have during those conversations. don't know if you have any more to add, Noah. Yes, question.
I'm going to ask a question. It's Sue. I'm just curious about, so always with a research study, there's like what you find and you report, and then there's little like personal experiences of running the study.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you would share some like impressions of like just what it was like running the study and I don't know, the enthusiasm that your participants had for doing it or anything like that.
Yeah, I would say we were kind of nervous about doing the study, and that 5 minutes is a really long time, I think, for anyone to talk with a stranger, and especially in a population where there is a lot of anxiety with getting to know an unfamiliar person. We weren't sure how the conversations would go, but I'd say in most of the conversations, when I was turning off the camera after the 5 minutes, like people still like really wanted to keep talking. And for some conversations, it took a while to find a point of interest for a lot of people, but eventually I'd say all of the dyads got there. Like people were able to talk about, you know, what's gonna happen in Avengers, or here's the video game that I really like playing. And so just looking at how the conversations went, I think people had a lot easier time interacting, but especially in looking at the autistic dyads, people definitely were able to find things of interest. And in fact, even after some of the conversations, people exchanged phone numbers. And one dyad group that I had, they still regularly get together and play Dungeons and Dragons. So I figured even if my dissertation is garbage, I don't find anything, at least I formed a friendship. So that was a pretty cool result from doing this project.
Yes. So this is Noah. In some ways, you know, the motivation of Kerrianne's dissertation was to test things in a more real-world context. We had plenty of findings of people forming first impressions versus on videos, and in a lot of ways, those findings did translate to a real-world context, although we did see some improvement in neurotypical judgments of autistic partners when they are forming those impressions through actual interaction relative to from a distance on a computer screen. So that was positive in some respects. It does kind of suggest that one, you know, mechanism for reducing prejudicial biases about differences that you may encounter is real-world contact. But also, I mean, even though this is in a real-world situation, it's still artificial in the sense that we are forcing people to continue with an interaction for 5 minutes time when presumably some of those awkward moments early in the interactions people would choose to disengage. So it's not completely a great reflection of how interactions work in the real world when you're meeting somebody, but it is a far big improvement from prior research, I think. And just the design of having to schedule two unfamiliar people to meet each other and then do the kind of complex dyadic analysis that Kerrianne implemented, where she can see what characteristics of the actor predicted a social interaction outcomes, what characteristics of the partner predicted outcomes, what unique combination interacting between the two partners predicts better outcomes. It's a way of more subtly examining how social outcomes are dependent on the unique combination of characteristics, interests, and traits of multiple partners instead of being completely dependent on a single person's characteristics. It's a relational approach to understanding social interaction outcomes.
I was going to jump in and say, actually, I think it does have high ecological validity in the sense that we're often forced into conversations by politeness and etiquette that we have to maintain with people, which we don't want to have. So there's another way of looking at that in the sense of...
And I have some amazing findings that were on the surface counterintuitive, not what we predicted. Kerrianne also measured, abilities on classic social cognitive tasks, recognizing emotion on faces, face perception, theory of mind tasks that have been used for decades in the autism literature, but she also gave them to the neurotypical participants. And perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not, performance on the social cognitive tasks by the autistic individuals were not very predictive at all at their social interaction outcomes. We do see, just like many studies have before, that autistic individuals on average, a lot of variability, perform worse than the neurotypical participants on those tasks, but it didn't translate into social interaction outcomes Interestingly, the social cognitive performance by the neurotypicals, however, did. They tended to, those with higher social cognitive performance on these tasks tended to be people, I don't know if Kerrianne, you want to characterize them, but people who were striving for more connection with their autistic partner. And I think some of the autistic partners viewed it as intrusive and distasteful. They rated those neurotypicals with higher social cognitive ability as being more awkward than the neurotypicals with lower social cognitive ability, because I think they were making more of an effort that was not always the preferred social interaction style of the autistic individual.
That is a very juicy detail.
Yeah.
And I find that extremely interesting little nugget of data. Thank you for sharing it.
So, the Diversity and Social Intelligence Project is looking at how autistic people share information with other people, and whether it's different based on whether the person that they're sharing that information with is also autistic or whether they're non-autistic, and also how that compares to how non-autistic people share information with each other. So a really big part of the study was using a thing called a diffusion chain, which is kind of like the game telephone. So you tell a person something, or you show them how to do something, and then you tell them that they have to tell the next person how to do that, or show them how to do it, then they have to tell the next person, and so on, and it goes on in a big long group of 8. And so what we did is we had groups of people come in, and we had groups of people who were, everyone in the group was autistic, and we had groups of everyone was non-autistic, and we had groups that had both autistic and non-autistic people in. And in the diffusion chains, we did different kinds of tasks. And kind of in a nutshell, what we found is that when we have groups of all autistic people, they have the same kind of clarity and accuracy of information transfer as groups of all neurotypical people. And when we have groups that alternate between autistic and non-autistic people, that's where we see a kind of loss of sharing of information between people. So that's when that kind of communication breaks down and the information isn't getting passed on as well. So that's quite a nice finding in terms of the double empathy problem, because it's kind of saying that it's when there is this kind of mismatch of salience, as Damian would put it, that we have this kind of loss of information between people.
Do you have any insight into what is driving the breakdown of communication between autistic and non-autistic people?